Has this ever happened to you? You get in your car, you turn the key, start cranking, start the engine. As soon as the engine starts, you're sitting there looking at a warning light. And the warning light is coolant level, and you're thinking, uh-oh, something's wrong here. And kind of the panic mode sets in. You think, man, I better get this to a mechanic, or something's wrong. I certainly don't want to drive it. And you shouldn't. If that coolant sensor light comes on, don't keep driving down the road. Obviously, if you're on the freeway, you want to plan to get off real quickly, and at the same time, you want to keep an eye on the engine temperature gauge. If that temperature gauge starts rising very quickly, then you may have to stop on the freeway, or you're going to fry the engine. So don't ignore it. But a lot of times, these lights will come on, and there's nothing wrong with your coolant. And this is particularly true with some of these older Mercedes that have sensors in the coolant reservoir tanks, because that sensor is like a little float valve, and when the coolant comes up and the float comes up, the light goes off, and when the float drops down, the light comes on. It's really quite simple. But check this out. If you're having a problem with your sensor, a dash light coming on, first thing you want to do is go check the coolant level. Obviously, if it's hot, don't pull the cap, but you can see through the side here. And if you have coolant at least up to this seam in the tank, then the first thing you want to suspect is that little float sensor inside the tank. Let me show you an old one that I recently pulled, and then I'll show you a new one up close, and we'll talk a little bit about the problems with these. The sensor is located right here on the side of the coolant reservoir tank, kind of down towards the bottom of the tank. So you can see that the coolant level has to get down towards this area right in here before it'll trigger a warning light on your dash. Normally the coolant level is right here at the split area of the tank. So if you can look down in here and you see coolant level above this area here and the light is on, suspect this part right here. But first, unplug it. Check for corrosion on the contacts. Make sure it has a tight fit. One thing I should mention, if you are going to replace this, you'll need to drain a little coolant out of your radiator, and then you'll need a snap ring plier. See that? You'll need a snap ring plier to spread this ring out to pull it out and replace it. Let me show you the old one that we removed. It was pretty gummed up. It had a whole bunch of crud right in this area here. And sometimes you can clean these up and get them to work again. But I found it's much easier just to replace it with a new one. They're so inexpensive. Sometimes these little floats get a little waterlogged. But you can see how it works. The coolant rises right up. And once it comes up to the top, it'll turn that light off. So let's talk about some of the other symptoms related to this particular part right here. If that warning light comes on your dash and you come out here and you realize the tank is empty, well, you're going to have to do some further diagnosis, because it's probably not that little float sensor. There are a couple things you should look for. Sometimes finding these coolant leaks can be really difficult. Obviously, one of the most common is leaking out of the water pump. And in a lot of the engines, particularly like this M104 engine, the water pump's kind of buried down in there. Even on some of the diesels, you really can't see. One of the tricks I've learned is drive the car, get it hot, and then come back in and shove some paper towels underneath the water pump. And then within 10 minutes, pull them out and see if they're wet. If the leak is small enough in a water pump, it could be drying while you're driving. It could be actually drying on the engine before it ever hits the ground, so you may not see drips underneath the car. So the water pump is one of the first things you want to suspect. And then, of course, radiator. Look for cracks, get the engine hot. Look for any kind of seepage in the seams along the top and the bottom of the radiator. And then, of course, hose clamps. But if you've inspected everything and you are mysteriously still losing coolant, there are a couple things you need to pursue. Number one is this window washer tank heater coil. Now be sure and check out my other video on that. When they leak, you can be leaking coolant into this tank right here. So if you see the level rising on your window washer tank, you know it's coming from engine coolant. Or if you squirt the windshield and suddenly it's kind of this greasy film, suspect that you're losing coolant into this tank right here. And then finally, you could have a head gasket leak, and the coolant could be going into the combustion chamber and burning and going out the exhaust, and in that case you're never going to see it. But there are some tests that can be done to determine if you're losing coolant, and if you don't have the ability to do that yourself, I recommend you take it to a shop and have them thoroughly test your engine to see if it could be a head gasket problem. And I would recommend a second opinion, because you want to make sure that is a problem before you have somebody start taking your engine apart to fix a coolant loss problem. So I hope that little tip's helpful, and let's make sure we keep the coolant in these engines, okay?